The document was never meant to exist on paper. In the digital age, the most consequential agreements leave no fingerprints. This one was codenamed Operation Palisade, and its terms were not negotiated by diplomats but by lawyers in a secure virtual data room that vanished 72 hours after the final terms were locked. It was a treaty between a millennium-old monarchy and the relentless engine of American justice, and its central clause was an act of historic sacrifice. The crown would surrender its most toxic prince to save itself from the testimony of a duchess. The impetus was not the subpoena itself, but the witness impact assessment prepared by MI5's Psychological Profiling Unit, delivered in a red-bound folder to the king's private secretary. The assessment predicted with chilling certainty what Meghan Markle would say if forced into open court. Subject will not default to denial. Her profile suggests she will adopt a posture of reluctant truth-teller, reframing her past as a survival narrative within a predatory ecosystem. This is more damaging than confession. She will name names, not as an accuser, but as a mapmaker. She will detail the social logistics, the flights, the introductions, the understood exchanges. She will, intentionally or not, provide the connective tissue between Prince Andrew's activities and the wider, respectable establishment that enabled him. This would shift the scandal from one bad prince to a corrupt network with the royal family at its center. The assessment concluded, containment of the witness is the only viable strategic objective. Her testimony must be purchased, not defeated. The purchase price was identified in a separate annex from the keeper of the royal archives. It listed the York papers. Not just Andrew's diaries, but a full spectrum of corroborating ephemera, annotated guest lists from his mother's private Balmoral teas, handwritten thank you notes from oligarchs for shooting weekends, the leather-bound logs from the royal helicopter detailing trips to Epstein's New Mexico ranch in 2010. This was not evidence for a trial, it was the annotated history of a royal fall from grace. The American side, led by a relentless deputy attorney general named Elena Vance, knew the value of what was being offered. But she wanted more than history. She wanted a guarantee. The diaries are the past, she stated during the final secure video conference, her face pixel-perfect on the monitors in the palace's Cobra briefing room. We need a lever on the future. We need the mechanism that allowed this to happen to be dismantled. We require the establishment of a permanent auditable protocol. No more gray suits smoothing things over. We want sunlight plumbed into the plumbing. Her demand was the Royal Household Transparency Covenant, RHTC. It stipulated that any member of the family beyond the sovereign and direct heir traveling overseas on private business must file a disclosure of intended associates with the newly formed Bilateral Oversight Office, BO, a joint US-UK body. Failure to comply would result in the automatic revocation of official diplomatic protection for that trip. It was, in essence, a parole officer for princes. Sir Michael Stevens, representing the Crown, felt the weight of history like a physical yoke. You are asking us to institutionalize the policing of our own family. We're asking you to stop hiding them, Vance replied coldly. The diaries show you've been hiding them for 30 years. The trade is simple. You give us the proof of the past and you agree to a monitored future. We give you the sealed testimony. Andrew takes the fall alone. The wider institution lives. The terms were agonizing, but the alternative was unthinkable. The treaty Operation Palisade was digitally signed with cryptographic keys at O3Ws Yonji. At 2Re3001, the first encrypted data packet containing scanned pages from Andrew's 2005 diary detailing a financier's retreat in Verbier with several now convicted sex offenders, began its transit to a DOJ server in Virginia. At that same moment, in a safe house in Oxfordshire, Meghan Markle was being prepped, not by her lawyers, but by a crisis communications expert hired by the palace. Her script was not a denial, it was a constrained narrative. You are a witness to a social environment, the expert coached, her voice calm. You are not a participant in crime. You are a sociologist describing a landscape. You use words like ecosystem, dynamics, unwritten rules. You do not use words like transaction or quid pro quo. You confirm facts. You do not volunteer context. Your tone is detached, anthropological. Meghan listened, her face a mask. She was being taught how to neuter her own story, to turn her lived experience into a sterile case study. In return, the apocalyptic public hearing would vanish. She would give her deposition in a private room at the US Embassy, The transcript would be sealed for 75 years. Andrew would be the sole villain, and she would walk away, legally insulated, her past entombed in a vault. It felt like victory. It felt like survival. She had no idea she was merely a clause in a larger, more devastating contract that had just traded a kingdom's secrets for her silence, and in doing so, had handed its enemies the master key to the castle. The backfire mechanism was already embedded in the terms. The Transparency Covenant, RHTC, was the poison pill. To enforce it, the Americans would need oversight, and oversight required access. The treaty, designed to contain a scandal, had just legally mandated a foreign powers inspection regime of the British monarchy. The palace, in its desperation to silence one woman, had signed a document that would silence its own sovereignty. The flaw in Operation Palisade was not in its encryption, its legal wording, or its strategic logic. The flaw was human. It was an archivist named Martin Cheswick. Cheswick, a 58-year-old lifelong civil servant in the Royal Archives, was a man who believed in the sanctity of the record. He was the one who had physically retrieved the York papers from the climate-controlled vault, his cotton-gloved hands trembling not from fear, but from a profound devotional reverence. To him, these were not leverage, they were fragments of the kingdom's soul. Watching the GCHQ specialists perform the high-resolution scan, he felt a pang of violation sharper than any personal insult. His role was to provide provenance verification for the scanned documents to affirm that the digital files matched the physical originals. As he cross-referenced, his meticulous eye noticed something the lawyers and spies had missed in their rush to deal. The diaries were not a single narrative, they were a palimpsest. Andrew's scrawled entries about parties and girls were the top layer, but beneath them, in faint pencil or hidden in the archaic shorthand of the royal household, were other notes. Scheduling notes from private secretaries, guest lists annotated by a lady-in-waiting with a single damning question mark next to certain names. A memo from the early 1990s, paperclipped to a page about security concerns regarding a specific financier, later overridden by a more senior official scrawl. HRH finds him amusing. Let it stand. The archive was not just Andrew's sins, it was the institution's complicity, written in its own hand. The palace had not just traded a prince's diaries, they had inadvertently traded the internal memos that showed the machine choosing to look away. Cheswick, a quiet man governed by a deep, unshakable morality, faced a crisis of conscience. He believed the lawyers had made the trade in ignorance of the full contents. He believed his duty was to the historical truth, not to a temporary political containment. He made a copy, not of the entire digital scan that was impossible, but of his own meticulous notes, his photographic memory of the most damning marginalia. He encrypted them on a personal drive using a method learned from a long-ago GCHQ training course. He intended to leak it to a historian, perhaps after his retirement. A slow, dignified revelation. But he made a single catastrophic error. He discussed his ethical dilemma in a low voice with a trusted colleague over tea in the archive's canteen. That colleague, burdened by mortgage payments and a son's university fees, saw a different opportunity. Within 48 hours, a senior editor at the Telegraph received an anonymous message with a sample, a scanned page of Andrew's diary with the attached, previously unseen memo about the amusing financier. The editor, recognizing the thermonuclear implications, did not publish. Instead, he took it to the head of MI5, asking a simple, terrifying question. Is the palace aware that the material they traded contains evidence of institutional negligence that could be construed as criminal misconduct? The leak was contained for now, but the secret was out among the innermost guardians of the state. The treaty had a critical vulnerability. It was based on an incomplete inventory. The Crown had traded a suitcase they believed contained only Andrew's dirty laundry, not realizing that stuffed in the lining were the signed receipts showing the palace dry cleaners had been servicing it for decades. This revelation reached Elena Vance at the DOJ not through official channels, but through a back-channel whisper from a contact in UK intelligence. Her reaction was not anger, but cold, strategic delight. The treaty was even more valuable than she thought. The Palisade wasn't just a wall of silence around Meghan, it was a trove of blackmail material against the palace itself. If they ever reneged on the terms, or if a future king tried to dissolve the bilateral oversight office, the existence of these sub-layer documents could be revealed, proving the crown had negotiated in bad faith, hiding evidence of its own malfeasance. She filed a sealed addendum to the Palisade Treaty in a secure vault known only to her and the Attorney General. It was titled Annex 7 Contingency for Breach. It authorized the unilateral release of the full, unredacted archive if the UK government ever attempted to nullify the transparency protocols. The treaty now had a dead man's switch, and the palace didn't know it. Meanwhile, the mechanism of the treaty began to grind into motion. The Bilateral Oversight Office, BO, was established in a bland office building near Vauxhall Cross. Its first act was not to monitor a royal tour, but to issue a clarification request regarding Prince Edward's scheduled visit to a tech conference in Saudi Arabia, noting that 3 of the conference's major sponsors were under DOJ investigation for bribery. The palace was forced to quietly postpone the trip. The backfire had begun. The treaty designed to protect the monarchy from external scandal was now causing internal paralysis, forcing it to police its own associations under a foreign microscope. And in a safe in Virginia, the proof of their historic negligence now sat, quietly doubling as both the purchased commodity and the sword hanging over their heads. They had traded a forest to stop a single fire, only to discover they'd handed over the map to every secret path within it. The backfire did not manifest as an explosion, but as a silent, systemic collapse. Operation Palisade, the secret treaty, functioned perfectly, and in doing so, dismantled the very authority it was designed to protect. The first visible crack was constitutional. The existence of the Bilateral Oversight Office, BOO, though classified, could not be hidden from the king's own Privy Council. When senior statesmen learned that a royal prince's travel now required pre-clearance from a committee containing FBI agents, a profound, silent rebellion took root. The next time the king requested the traditional order in council to approve a minor royals tour of the Caribbean, the document was returned unsigned by the Lord President of the Council, with a handwritten note, "Until the constitutional implications of external advising bodies on royal movements are resolved, I cannot in good conscience approve." The ancient machinery of royal prerogative had seized. The monarchy was frozen by its own bargain. The second crack was financial. The Transparency Covenant had a trigger clause. When the BOO's first clarification request caused Prince Edward's Saudi trip to be postponed, a major contract for a UK cybersecurity firm, of which Edward was a quiet patron, was withdrawn. The firm's board, livid, sued the prince's charity for negligent misrepresentation of political risk. The lawsuit, though frivolous, would force discovery a legal process that could subpoena BOO documents and expose the entire treaty. The palace was forced into a multi-million-pound confidential settlement. The treaty was now costing them real money, creating a tangible, bleeding wound. But the final, terminal backfire was historical. Martin Cheswick, the archivist, consumed by guilt over his colleague's betrayal and the palace's continued ignorance, did something quietly radical. He did not leak to the press. Using his lifetime of access, he began meticulously transcribing only the marginalia, the overlooked memos, the questioning annotations, the overridden security warnings that proved institutional knowledge. He compiled them into a single, dense monograph titled A Record of Unseeing Administrative Annotations to the York Papers, 1989 to 2011. He submitted it, under a pseudonym, to the Journal of Contemporary British History, where it underwent peer review and was accepted for publication as a groundbreaking study of courier culture and risk assessment. The article was dry, academic, and devastating. It contained no salacious details from Andrew's diaries. Instead, it printed the memo about the amusing financier. It reproduced the lady-in-waiting's worried question marks. It was an autopsy of institutional failure, written in the institution's own hand, published in a respected forum where the palace's lawyers could not cry fake news or invoke privacy. The crown had traded the diaries to bury a scandal and in return had inadvertently funded its own scholarly indictment. The treaty had backfired in every possible dimension. Politically, it paralyzed the monarchy. Financially, it drained its resources. Historically, it provided the evidence for its condemnation. The sunlight plumbed into the plumbing that the Americans demanded had not just illuminated the pipes, it had revealed the entire foundation was rotten. And in the harsh light, the structure began to crumble. They had traded Andrew's diaries to silence Meghan, and in the process had given the world a permanent, unimpeachable record of their own silence. The secret was no longer what Andrew had done. The secret, the fatal, backfiring secret, was how long and how meticulously the palace had chosen not to see it.